So I think this panel really feeds off our first of the day, which looked at the importance of scaling up to a sort of profitable level for the industry. So in particular, we're going to look at different customer acquisition strategies, and perhaps I think, although we already had Adam French from Scalable Capital, perhaps Ellie, you could start by just telling us a bit more about Scalable Capital for those people who perhaps weren't here this morning.
Okay, I hope I'm not going to repeat too much of what Adam already said. So Scalable basically was founded at the end of 2014. We launched first in Germany early last year, and then in the UK in the middle of last year, around June, July. So we've basically been an international business right from the outset, with an office in Munich and an office here in London, and our founder team is basically British, Austrian, German as well. And I think we try to differentiate ourselves from other offerings in the market by our focus on risk management. So we really believe that in order for investors to basically stay invested over the long run, we need to help them with the risk management element, because what most people are scared of when it comes to investing is obviously the risk that comes with investing. And we feel that what was missing in the market was a robo-advisor or digital wealth manager who didn't just repackage the onboarding process into a digital process and didn't just make it more accessible through lower minimums and made it cheaper, but who also used technology to fundamentally improve the investment process itself. So what we do basically is we don't offer model portfolios. We don't work with, let's say, 10 different risk categories, and then every risk category has certain fixed asset class weightings. Instead, we work with fluid weights for the different ETFs that we have in the portfolio. So all of our investors pick a certain risk category, and there are 23 different risk categories, and they are all measured with a risk measure called valued risk that I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with. And then basically we monitor every individual client portfolio every single day using our technology that runs tens of thousands of simulations for every portfolio. And then we basically check whether the current portfolio allocation is still in line with the investor's risk category. So basically, does it have the value at risk that the client has selected or not? And if it's either too conservative or too aggressive, then we're going to make an automatic adjustment of that portfolio to keep it in line with the investor's risk expectation and profile. And that doesn't just have the effect that we believe it makes it easier for people to stay invested in the longer run, because there are going to be less nasty surprises for them. But there's also been some research to show that it can help with performance over the long run as well. So that's the concept behind Scalable, and we now have more than 10,000 customers across Austria, Germany, and the UK. We are investing more than 300 million for those clients. I'm fairly confident that we're going to be at 500 million very soon. BlackRock has invested into Scalable just in June this year, where we raised a 30 million euro funding round, our Series B funding. And just about 2 weeks ago, we've launched a partnership with ING in Germany. So we are fully integrated into ING's website now. It's a co-branded partnership. So we've received access to 8.5 million ING customers in Germany now, which is obviously very exciting, and it's been a phenomenal success, the collaboration so far. So it's been going really well.
Excellent. And Ben, perhaps you could just give us an introduction to MoneyBox for those who don't know.
Yeah, so MoneyBox is a mobile saving and investing platform targeted primarily at the under 40s. I guess the way that we differentiate from other platforms is more trying to help people set money aside in the first place. So our pre-launch research suggested that people intended to save in a structured way but don't really get around to it. And often they find investment options just not communicated very clearly to them. So we try to address those issues. So we try to inspire action, so break inertia one of the ways we do that is making it really easy to sign up. We have this concept of roundups where you can round up the change from everyday transactions and invest it. So we put more of the focus on the setting aside money part, doing that in a structured way over time, and introducing people to simple investments. So what we hope is that we can get a large number of people started on this journey and then grow with this customer base as it grows over time.
And Dan, obviously you spoke this morning, but maybe just as a refresher, could you talk us through RiskSave?
Sure. Apologies for people here this morning. So my name is Dan Tammas-Hastings. I'm the founder of RiskSave along with another business partner. We are a B2C concept, but we've morphed into a B2B player. Our main differentiation is in investment process. We come from a pensions background, and what we've seen in the pensions industry, where currently the UK is considered a leader in the world, is that large institutional schemes and the better staff schemes have moved across to what we call a liability-driven investment framework, or an LDI framework. And what's basically happening is, if you are lucky enough to be part of a large corporate scheme, or you are very, very well taken care of, you'll have an LDI framework looking after your investments. If you are at the smaller end of the market, you won't be. And ultimately, the end needs of users of big schemes, small schemes, and retail are essentially the same. We all have our own savings goals, but they're roughly similar. We want to retire at a certain age, we want to meet long-term healthcare costs, and our focus is introducing these LDI frameworks onto other platforms. We have looked at markets, and we believe, well, certainly we found that cost of customer acquisition is possibly too high, and we're approaching other platforms to then use our own skill. But what we've seen recently is cost of customer acquisition does seem to be falling, which you guys will probably know a lot about.
So perhaps, Ben, you could sort of pick up on that point, and I would say that out of all of my peers, probably more have the MoneyBox app than any of the other robo-advisors, well, digital wealth managers that we've heard from today. But I would say the one person who I know who does have a Scalable Capital account probably has more in it than all of those people combined. So, I mean, Ben, can you talk a little bit about how you go about acquiring customers? Is it all through recommendations from friends and referrals? Is it through advertising? Is it through digital content?
I think that's an interesting point. Just before I get into it, that not all customers are the same, and say the problem that Ella and her company are trying to solve is arguably a little different to the problem that we're trying to solve. Sure. So it's important to note that. In terms of how we go about customer acquisition, so we are mobile only, which means that we primarily acquire customers through mobile channels. Those are primarily mobile social channels because that's where our customers live. Our customers are just over 30, pretty wealthy, and probably on their phones a lot. so that's kind of where we get them. We do a little bit of above the line, a bit of tube and TV, but relatively small. So I guess in terms of kind of differentiation, like mobile a little bit, video a little bit, and then in terms of messaging, we found what works well for us is this concept of roundups. I think a challenge that all of us have in acquiring customers is persuading the potential customer to act today. It's a bit like perhaps exercising more, drinking less, when's the nice time to start it tomorrow? And the question here is like, why should someone start it today? We often kind of joke a bit about tube advertising. You have a tube carriage of a couple of hundred people. How many of those couple of hundred people, when it's 7:30, have got out of bed and said, right, what I really want today is to choose my retail investment platform? There'll be one or two, maybe. But it's not kind of we're a slate audience here. But it's not that's not what most people are thinking about. People might be thinking about buying a house, getting married, having kids, retirement, that kind of stuff. But they're probably not saying, hey, what should I do on my retail investment platform? So I think a challenge that we face for sure. I think a challenge that the industry faces is figuring out ways to inspire action today. And I'm not saying that we've kind of perfected it by any means, but one way we have of doing this is having this roundup concept, because people kind of like it and it gets them started. Being mobile, so people can literally do it on a bus or probably on the tube now as well, and just making it really, really easy to get going. So that's kind of been our approach so far.
Interesting. So, Ella, you obviously already mentioned the partnerships that have been big milestones for you guys at Scalable Capital this year. To what extent will partnerships play a big role in the next 12 months and the next 2-3 years? Will you be looking for further sort of reaches into existing client pools?
Yeah, so I believe that partnerships will continue to be extremely relevant for us, because ING DiBa, for example, is Germany's third largest bank by number of customers. It's been voted Germany's most popular banks for years in a row, basically. So almost everyone that I know in Germany has an account with ING DiBa. And I think, and also they've been Germany's first direct bank, so online bank, basically. So people love ING DiBa because they've been online very early. They always put the customer first. They are low cost in everything that they do. They're quite radical in not offering sort of products that they feel people don't really need just because they could make money with them. So I think partnering with someone like that has huge impact. So we've basically seen a lot of people that have been on our newsletter list for a long time already convert now after we made that announcement, because they said, I'm an ING DiBa client, so it's going to be much easier and faster for me now to onboard, because they don't have to go through the KYC process anymore, because ING is also the custodian bank for that part of the business now. But also they said it's a huge confirmation that what you are doing actually makes sense, because if ING DiBa has looked at you and selected you out of all the possible options there would have been out there, then I believe that you really are the right people to manage my money for me. So if we can achieve something similar in a different country, I think that would be tremendous. And we are actually having a lot of conversations here in the UK, still in Germany, but also in some other geographies across Europe. We're not having any conversations right now outside of Europe, because we think the European market is really the first step for us, and there's a lot of wealth here that needs to be managed in Europe, so we wouldn't look beyond that. But there are definitely several deals in the pipeline. There's one deal that we've basically signed already with another bank. Several more conversations that I think have reached a stage where I would say they are fairly likely to happen. And they could be either white labeled, or it could be a co-branded collaboration like with ING DiBa, even though in Germany there is an exclusivity for that kind of deal now for 3 years. But outside of Germany, we would also be open for co-branded relationships. Yeah,
that's very interesting, and I think the white label model is very much sort of Dan, you with RiskSave. Can you talk about how is that correct, and is that how are you approaching that?
Yeah, so I mean, we've always been strong believers in that robo-advice is the future of financial advice, and it's a product that society needs. But what we've seen globally is that a standalone B2C model hasn't ever been successful. So whilst we've always wanted to provide that service, it hasn't necessarily been one that we could do commercially. So what we've looked at is how do you acquire customers? Say, for example, you wanted to have 100,000 customers in the UK. What would that cost? How would you do it? How would you get that database together? How would you, once you've got that database together, refine it to the people that might then convert into robo-advice users, and how would they make sure that they came to your platform and stuck on your platform? And all of that would be a long, long journey. But then we just look at the legacy players that are already there. Lloyd's TSB, or no, so Lloyd's now, has 10 million customers in its own right. And actually, I think it's partnering with people that already have the customers, and then you don't need to worry so much about the customer acquisition costs, and you can provide the service and focus on your niche, which for us is the investment process and the risk management. But the interesting thing that we found when we speak to potential customers, and this is across the institution spectrum from very small to reasonably large, is that we've always been very focused on the investment process. We think that's the most important thing. We think differentiation by risk management is really important, because if you've got stronger risk management, you get better returns. But then what we find in meetings is no one wants to talk about investment, which is a shame, because that's been my career, and I've got some facts in there. They just want to talk about compliance and suitability. And what we found is we spend a lot of time talking about suitability and very little time talking about the investment process. But I think part and parcel of what we're doing is just being around for 2 years now, having demonstrated that we understand the FCA's processes and what suitability is, and what was the word that we used earlier? Robust, consistent, compliant. Having demonstrated that, then as players seek to enter this market, we're there, we're ready for them, and we have a product.
Very good. At this stage, any questions from the floor? Please.
Maybe one for Ella. Could you argue that the robo investment into ETFs and passive investment in general has actually distorted the marketplace, and that actually the market's due a correction by virtue of the fact that there's too much passive investment, or actually chasing a small amount of the market?
I think robo-advice in particular would not have been able to achieve that, because I don't have the exact figure now, but I think the amounts globally managed by robo-advisors are maybe in the area of 50 to 100 billion euros, which is nothing in terms of global investment. So your question is more around passive instead of robo-advice, basically. I think also the amount of money that is invested into passive instruments these days is still way less than what's invested in active. And in particular, when you look at the trading flows, most of the trading flows are still determined by active management and not by passive investors. Particularly when you look at a retail ETF investor, that's not typically like a day trader. A lot of these people invest for the long run, and they don't turn over their portfolio 10 times a year. So I think there are a lot of people that say the regulators need to look more closely into ETFs, and I actually think that's right, but I'm very, very confident that there is nothing strange or dangerous around ETFs that they're going to discover. But I think in order to underline that point, I would actually appreciate if the regulator looked into the potential risk, because I think there's a lot of speculation out there right now, and I'm not sure that a lot of it is very well founded. But if the regulator were to find something, that would be interesting. So I would encourage them to look into it, and then we have a more open debate about it, I think.
I would actually say that as well. I've spoken about systemic risk with both the regulators and the larger investment consultants, and we're quite sanguine on it, even though we do worry about the structure of ETFs themselves. Because actually, in a crisis, when you have the possible events you were talking about, people change their positions between fixed income and equities and potentially commodities, and they do it in a quite rigorous way. But they change the asset class, not the kind of exposure they're getting. So the fact that they're changing from asset class A to asset class B in a passive way rather than an active way doesn't actually affect the market stability at all. And there is an argument that because ETFs are more liquid in that situation, but actually the system is more robust, which I sort of agree with, because actually next time there's a crisis, do you want to be long 100 million BlackRock iShares or a random small private bank active equity fund that actually ultimately you're not going to get out of in time? I'd rather have the ETFs all day.
Although the ETFs will be very dependent on providers, and so therefore there isn't that much liquidity online, actually on screen. Agree, but
the liquidity in the ETFs is larger than the liquidity in the active funds. Now, ultimately, what I would prefer to do is possibly use futures, but for regulatory reasons and the fact that it does scare retail investors, we've stuck very much to ETFs. Now, ultimately, as an ex-hedge fund manager and a trader, I'd much rather use the future, but in this world, we can't really do it.
Surely what's going to happen is that if you see ETFs across the board, which is what would happen, that's the easy way to get that, just to put down the pressure on the large capital in the market, which could become to an extent a self-healing fund.
But how is that?
That's not going to affect the less liquid names, which possibly.
But that process still happens if people are still actively in large active stocks. They're still the most liquid things first, which will be the large global large caps, and that process will still happen. The fact that they're in a passive wrapper doesn't actually affect it, I don't think. Now, there's definitely less liquidity in the market now, definitely, but I don't think that's because of a change from passive to active. I think it's because people are a bit more scared of taking risks because of the way that investment banking culture has changed.
Just a question for Ella. So you guys are active in both Germany and the UK. from a fintech or a wealth tech perspective, which regulatory environment you find is friendlier to these sort of new companies?
I think there's no meaningful difference, to be honest. I think we got our license in Germany faster. We got it within 6 months. In the UK, it took us 12 months. But I think that was more or less pure coincidence. There were a couple of things related to the person that managed our application at the FCA that were just, bad luck, basically. So a couple of things that happened. I think it could have taken longer with the BaFin in Germany. It could have happened faster with the FCA. I think both regulators really support innovation, while at the same time, obviously, making sure that we don't get a carte blanche, basically, to do whatever we want just because we're a new, exciting fintech business, right? And I think it's actually important as well that the type of business that we are engaging with is regulated, because we are investing people's money, and that is a very serious business, and it's people's savings, and they want to invest for their retirement. So I think it is important that it's properly regulated. But I couldn't say there was a real difference.
And do you provide a service for consolidation of portfolios in your platform?
So in Germany, what you can, let me try and see whether I understand your question correctly. So what you can do right now in Germany, for example, is you can transfer an existing portfolio free of charge, and then we will sell the assets that you hold in that portfolio and reinvest according with your selected risk category in our platform. What we don't provide yet, but it's definitely something that would be interesting to look into in the future, is to allow, particularly through PSD2 basically as well, to allow people to add other portfolios that they may have, or even other assets that they have, or maybe a savings account, a current account, and so on, to their Scalable Capital account, so that they can see all of these other things online as well and in their apps as well. And potentially, and that would even then be the next step, to take those other assets and portfolios into consideration as we run our risk optimization algorithm. But that's something for the future. It's not something we do right now.
Last question? Yeah, please.
That's a question for Dan. And I've got your pain in terms of partners, successful compliance and suitability, and not risk management. Do you think, in your opinion, is the FCA behind the curve in terms of saying that proper investment advice should involve proper ongoing risk management?
I think the FCA is ahead of every other regulator in the world. That's, I would say, was that definitely true? Maybe true? I have to say it, but
They're definitely up there, I would say.
yeah. I think one thing that worries me is because actually when we try and define risk, we all have different definitions, and actually it's a very subjective thing and no one really knows. One thing that does bother me when I was making suitability reports and thinking about it is that actually I see people investing with 3 or 4% fees, and I say, how can that possibly be suitable? And I do think that potentially the FCA has a very easy thing to do, and it could put fee caps in, and maybe they're a bit behind the curve on that. But I've never even seen that in debate anywhere. So
I should add that there are probably 1 or 2 people from the FCA at least on the list to come. So. Don't be too rude.
Regulator in the world. Don't say that.
Well, thank you very, very much to our panel. And if we'd like to give a round of applause and have the next panel up, please.